Hi, everybody. Welcome back. My name is Rory Truex. This is the Civic Forum. As you know, I created this space this summer as a place for people to come together and talk about the bigger picture issues facing American democracy. It was never meant to be a blue space or a red space, but a pro-democracy space. And I wanted to start the session off today by just acknowledging the murder of Charlie Kirk and condemning that act of political violence. This is a sad day for American democracy. This is an act that should be widely condemned across the political spectrum by Democrats and Republicans. It's an act that has no place in a healthy democracy, and it's a moment we should all be reflecting on. My heart goes out to people who knew Charlie, to his wife and his two children, and people who are close to him and who are inspired by him. I do not agree with him on many political issues, but again, I condemn the act, and my sympathy and empathy goes out with people who are close to him. I would note that this is a space, as you've noticed, that has highlighted the authoritarian aspects of the Trump administration, and that came from my own concern. There's a lot of discourse online right now about how this murder is on the hands of the Democrats and people who have used words like fascist and authoritarian. And I just wanted to respond to that and say very clearly, in case it wasn't already clear, that when I talk about authoritarianism here or in other places, and when I talk about resisting authoritarianism, I mean resisting it in democratic ways, right? So how does one effectively resist authoritarian power grabs like what we're seeing now? It's through democratic actions, winning votes, political mobilization, peaceful protests, communicating with the other side, building relationships. And political violence, like what we saw yesterday, has no space in the pro-democracy movement. And so if at any time I say anything on any one of these sessions or in any other space that could be construed as condoning or supporting any act like that, please do call me out. That is not what I stand for, and I'm firmly committed to nonviolent political action. So that said, I do have a very interesting and important session today. I'm going to welcome my friend Kevin Arceneaux, if I'm competent enough to get him to come up on stage. Kevin, or more fondly known as Vin Arceneaux, is a very good friend of mine, a co-author of mine. He used to work at Temple and live in Philadelphia, where I lived, and we did a commute together of about an hour for about a year. And so we really got to know each other many years ago and have subsequently worked on a bunch of different projects together. Vin has left us from Philadelphia. He now lives in Paris. I'm not going to call that an upgrade, but it is nice over there. He is the director of a center called CEVIPOF, which is a center for the study of social sciences and political science at Sciences Po, focusing on political attitudes and behavior, among other things. Vin studies American politics, and he's quite well known in our field for his studies of political psychology. So he's someone who really understands how American voters think, the underlying psychological processes, why they gravitate towards different types of politicians, how they think about political violence. And so today I've asked Vin to just speak a little bit about his ideas and his research about political attitudes, polarization, violence, the full range. Do people support this type of government and some of the things that are unfolding in the American political system? And so our goal today is to touch on some of these bigger picture questions. So Vin, thank you for joining me. I think it's like 6 o'clock your time. You're missing dinner over there, which was probably delicious. But here you are on a webinar. So I appreciate you coming.
Thank you, Rory. It's always really a pleasure to exchange with you, and your friendship has meant a lot to me as well. And so, thank you for having me on on your program to discuss these really weighty issues that unfortunately are alive and well in democratic spaces like the United States. And so, the question you posed to me is, do Americans support authoritarian government? And I prepared a little bit to sort of try to answer that question. It's a bit trickier than it might seem to say yes or no to this question. And I think that one way to start is to start with some definitions and to define what we mean by authoritarian and to distinguish it from authoritarian government. And as you sort of noted your introduction to me, very generous introduction to me, Rory, I study political psychology and political behavior, and sort of putting that in sort of layman terms, I'm the type of political scientist who studies the social psychology of everyday people. Why do people do what they do? Why do they form the attitudes that they do? So let's start with this question of being an authoritarian. And I think that's a charge that often gets thrown around in political discourse, and usually it has a negative connotation. But what does this mean? And I have to tell you, there's been so much written on the authoritarianism, that I would take all day to get into it, and it would be not very useful. But scholars argue about, is it a personality? Is it a set of values? Is it an orientation? Is it an ideology? And those are really interesting questions for academics. But from the standpoint of your question, I think that it is really not important, because more or less there's some agreement on the core of what it means to be an authoritarian. And this is, I'm going to highlight three: preferences for conformity to group norms, a preference for a strong authority figure that enforces those group norms, and a strong dislike for things that are unfamiliar and challenge one's worldview. Now, there's a sense that, in fact, a debate among scholars, but also I think a sense out there that authoritarians gravitate to the political right. And there is some evidence for this, especially on sort of cultural or way of life issues. But there are some that do gravitate to the left. Okay, so those are authoritarians. I'm going to leave that for now. I'm going to move on to this next thing that's in your question: authoritarian government. Now, since we have the word government in there, we're actually talking about a set of political institutions. So in this case, when you talk about authoritarian government, you're really talking about a set of institutions that consolidate power in the hands of a person or a group of people. And those institutions are designed to keep that person or those people in power and to expand their reach into all levels of society. Now, the best way to think about this is to contrast it with something that we call liberal democracy. And liberal here does not refer to a political ideology, to be on the left or to be liberal. It actually refers to this idea of liberty. So the key feature of a liberal democracy is just to do something that's the opposite of authoritarian government, and that is to constrain government authority so that the government can't limit people's fundamental rights and freedoms. So the institutions in a liberal democracy are designed to make government accountable to citizens, while also providing safeguards that protect civil liberty from sometimes the tyranny of the majority. So to even put constraints on what a majority can do. All right, so I'm going to put these two things together, okay? In some sense, they're both related. Authoritarians, people who are basically want conformity, they like a strong leader. These folks are more likely to prefer a form of government that does just that, that has a strong leader that can enforce their group norms. And there is a tendency to see this on the right, especially on cultural issues, but you can also see it on the left too. And this is something that is actually kind of interesting, that it depends on the context. So in context where the cultural right values are dominant, then you see people with authoritarian values, if you will, preferring authoritarian governing practices. But in those contexts where the cultural left might be dominant, the opposite is the case. You can actually see people on the left who espouse authoritarian values, wanting authoritarian approaches to government. Anyway, all that said, let me answer your question with all that in place. There's some good news here. People with strong authoritarian tendencies are a relatively small group, especially among Americans, okay? And on surveys, if you ask people all sorts of questions about the kind of government they want, most Americans, a vast majority of Americans, I should say, support liberal democracy. They do not support authoritarian government in the abstract, okay? That's the good news. Now I have on the other hand for you. There are two caveats, and I think these are two very important caveats. The first is that in specific instances, many Americans are willing to rationalize violations of democratic norms and procedures. and I think this might be something we can get into later, but they do it usually under two instances: if it benefits their political team, or if it's premised on providing them with policy outcomes they like. So the sort of security liberty trade-off that people often talk about. But in this instance, it's important that I say they rationalize it, so they don't even admit to themselves that what's happening is an erosion of democracy. Second, many Americans, not a majority, but a sizable portion, say something that might seem strange at first glance, and that's the following. They would like to have a strong leader that can ignore, say, Congress or sort of the liberal model of doing things, provided that this strong leader listens to ordinary people. Now, this is something that scholars often call illiberal populism. So it's the idea that the people should always prevail, even at the expense of liberal democracy. So if I were to be a little bit less optimistic, I would say that Americans want liberal democracy in the abstract, but many are willing to give it up for different reasons, either something to do with partisan politics, a belief that the majority is always right. And often what we see too is a reaction to either status loss or status threat. So a concern that their status in society is in jeopardy. And given that we're living in a time where there's growing inequality and the effects of globalization, at least as the effects they're having in the West, are in some ways aggravating this. As a result, even if most Americans don't want to live in an authoritarian system, they may be willing to vote for politicians who, in the end, roll back liberal democratic institutions in the name of creating more democracy. And that's a paradox. Because in doing so, they actually make it possible, those sorts of politicians make it possible to consolidate power in their hands, which is consistent with authoritarian government.
Well, that was a pretty darn thorough. You've answered the question, Vin. We should just end this thing right now. No stone left unturned with that. I did want to pick up on this sentiment that you're highlighting, which is that people gravitate towards a strong leader that's responsive to the people directly, and what you call the illiberal populism, in order to enable some form of greater democracy, whatever that would look like. And in your other work, you've coined a term called the need for chaos, and this is this idea that there is a set of people in our societies, and not just in the U.S. and many other developed democracies, that basically want to burn it all down. You actually quote Batman, I believe, Alfred, if I'm recalling correctly, from The Dark Knight, saying some men just want to watch the world burn. Well, very few Batman quotes in political science papers, but you managed to do it. But this idea that the system is broken, right? And so part of the reason I think why people are gravitating towards someone like Trump or his analogs in other developed democracies is because there's a feeling that democracy is not working for people. All these checks and balances, all the gridlock, all the partisan bickering, log rolling, it's failing to deliver the goods. It's failing to raise people's incomes. It's failing to solve basic governance challenges. And so can you connect those dots for us? Can you tell us a little bit more about what is this need for chaos and how is it connected to some of the themes you've already raised?
I think you did a pretty good job of actually doing it right there. But to sort of complete the thoughts that you raised there, on the one hand, you do have the fundamental critiques that you often have of liberal democracy is it either slows things down, or sometimes it thwarts majorities so it can protect the rights of minorities. Now, here I mean minorities. When I say minorities, I mean this in the broadest sense, right? So not just we tend to think about sort of potentially oppressed groups, but minority can also be rich people, right? That their rights can be protected under these systems, and this sometimes can create a notion that the political system is there to protect those who are privileged, on the one hand, or, interestingly enough, that the political system is advantaging those at the expense of one of someone else, from the person who thinks this from their viewpoint. And this can be broad. You can put this on anything. So you could be a really well-off, highly educated person and feel like you're being screwed over by the system, that the system is passing you over so that way others can succeed or have their rights or whatever respected. Or you could be somebody that's on the bottom and you feel like the system is just giving handout to rich people. So this is a very broad concept. But when people feel this way, they come to blame the system for their problems. And therefore, it makes sense that you want to get rid of that system, right? That could be the first move is to say, let's just get rid of this. Let's burn it all down to the ground. So the research I did with Matthias Asmundsen and Michael Bang-Peterson, so I should mention that I didn't do this by myself. We came up with this idea called need for chaos. And the central notion here is that some people, not everybody, thankfully, it's a small group of people, but some people, they actually, when they feel like this, they feel like they're being screwed over, and they feel like it's the system that is screwing them over. That what they want to do, what feels comfortable to them for them is to create a lot of chaos so they can help bring down the system and in the process move to the top. Okay. Now, fortunately enough, this is a small group of people that have these kind of really ugly, you mentioned Batman, some people just want to see some men just want to see the world burn. There's a larger group of people who in this
when you say small group of people, you've done work on the actual proportion. So what's your estimate? Like 5%. Two questions. So give us like the rough fraction of the population, and how are you measuring this? What, like when you're polling somebody and trying to measure need for chaos, what are the types of questions? Like, how do I know if I have high need for chaos?
Yeah. So we ask questions like, we should just tear all down the institutions and start again. We should, and then we also have questions like, I get a kick out of, stirring up trouble. I enjoy watching. So I enjoy when natural disasters happen in other countries. So what we really want to get at on the highest end of this scale, right? So people answer these questions and then we put them on a scale. People who answer, in ways that suggest they really just like chaos for the sake of chaos and especially want to like reset things. Those people are high need for chaos. And to answer your first question, this is a really small group, thankfully. So around 5% of the American population rates really high on that. That said, there's a larger group of people that they don't answer yes to the sort of what I would call chaos for the sake of chaos questions, like liking natural disasters, but they do agree to this idea of resetting society, and that you can see closer to around, depending upon what sample or whatnot, somewhere between 15 and 20% of Americans can fall in that category, which shows you the degree to which you might have some considerable group in America that is so unhappy with the system that they're open to the idea of somebody coming along and making fundamental changes.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting concept because I think even there's a lot of people that feel a need for change, right? Like a need for reform. And increasingly, again, I don't study American politics, but I am an American citizen. And you look at this system and you're like, this is not built properly for the long. We need change. We need some form of electoral reform, maybe, to allow more parties to form. We need something significant to happen. But I would never want violence to beget that change. I would want it to happen through democratic processes. But I think there is this appetite for big change, right, and whether that's economic redistribution. But I think the distinction between the need for chaos people and maybe I think what you call rebuilders or changers, reformers, is the process, right? It's are you okay with violence, chaos, just complete social disorder in order to affect that change?
That's exactly right. That's the key difference. And the other thing I would say about the rebuilders here too is that, and the reason why, there are many ways in which you can get support for authoritarian government without people realizing they're supporting authoritarian government. This is kind of the point I'm trying to get at, which is that you can have people that want radical change, and they kind of want, in order to get that radical change, they're willing to sort of push sort of procedures to the side. And so you could imagine what you just said there, Rory, is like, sure, I think there are many instances in which, if you ask me my personal political opinions, sure, there's lots of changes I would probably make to the American system to make it more open, to make it a little more fair or just, based on my definitions, right? But in order to get those, there's two different ways, right? You can do it in an incremental way that respects the sort of constitutional order, or you can just try to sort of wipe it clean. And so you can sort of populist leaders or sort of populist politicians, which I would put Trump in that basket, but also, on the left, we can think of like Bernie Sanders or other, it's not, I don't think it's just folks on the right to do this, but, Donald Trump famously said, I'm going to drain the swamp. That's saying exactly that. Let's start over. There's too much corruption here, and you can't fix it at the margins. You have to wipe it clean. And that kind of rhetoric or that kind of idea resonates with folks who feel that way.
And one thing you've done in your work is to look at who are these people, right? Descriptively, I think we have a sense of what this type of person looks like. One thing I noticed in some of your work is that it is correlated with ideology. So we see higher need for chaos on the political right. But in the US, it's almost like a U shape, right? It's people, it's higher on the far right, it's lowest in the middle, and then right. it's in the far left too. It's not as high as in the far right, but it is in the far left. And if I recall correctly, this is different than in other countries, right? So that U is not necessarily the case. You've done work on Canada, which has an oddly high need for chaos, if I recall correctly. We think of Canadians as so kind and docile, but there's a lot of angst up there as well. So can you tell us a little bit about who has high need for chaos? Yeah. And how do Americans compare? Is this a uniquely American attribute?
It's certainly not a uniquely American thing. And like you said, we see in Canadians, we see it in Australians, we see it in French folks. It's everywhere. But the way it works in the U.S., one of the most interesting things that make Americans a bit different is that you see. It's part of this U shape. It gets at this. In the U.S., you see people that gravitate towards need for chaos of two types. People that are in the sort of status hierarchy of the United States would be maybe ranked historically. They fall in more disadvantaged groups. You see folks there espousing things that are higher in need for chaos. But also we see it among people who you might say this is a bit strange. So people with wealth, people, and also people who come from sort of more advantaged groups. So, white. So in one paper we found white young men are more likely to fall in this category of being higher in need for chaos. And the interesting thing in the US is there's something going on where you kind of have a strange bedfellows of people that are economically, materially worse off. Clearly, you can see why they might want to change the system, but also those who are doing quite well. And it seems like what's going on with them is they fear status loss. They fear that what's happening right now is taking away their rightful place in society. And I think some of this, you get at some of this with the critiques of DEI and these kinds of things, I think echo a concern that some people have that the political system as it is constructed right now is actively coming after them. So, this is something that's interesting that we see that seems to be happening much more in the U.S. than we've seen in the other data, for instance, in the data I've looked at in France. So, I think I don't have a really good. I have some ideas about why that's the case, but I don't have a really excellent explanation for why that's what's going on right now in the U.S.
So one more question on need for chaos, and then we will move on to a couple other topics. I know you don't always love talking about your own work, but it is fascinating. It's one thing to hold these attitudes, and then acting on them or participating in the political world in a certain way is another thing. So does need for chaos lead to what we might call like antisocial political behavior? Does it matter, or is it just people sitting at their computers typing mean comments on social media?
I mean, mostly, again, when you measure, it's hard for us to measure behavior, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
So a lot of what we have is what people say they would do. The best behavioral measures we have in our studies are giving people, chances to share sort of false rumors. And what we see, people who are high need for chaos, they love sharing false rumors, even if it's about their political side. I mean, they really are out just to kind of troll people and create chaos. And we know that's actually consequential online because most of the disinformation that is circulated online comes from a really small group of people. So you don't need a lot of people for that to be problematic. But if we move outside of offline, people who are higher in need for chaos, they're more likely to condone political violence, the use of violence to get what they want. They think that's okay. They're more likely to sort of basically support the kinds of things that undermine liberal democratic norms and values.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up violence. And again, given the moment, this is the day after Charlie Kirk's murder. This is also September 11th. Talk to me a little bit about how do Americans think and feel about political violence? From what I understand of the field, it again has this sort of mixed result where Americans broadly condemn political violence. There's been work by some of our colleagues that characterizes it as very infrequent support, very low levels of support for political violence. Under 3% of the population roughly is okay with things like what happened yesterday. So very, very low levels of support, we should say. And including reactions to events like that, there's also been some research that suggested in the wake of the assassination attempt on Donald Trump that support for political violence decreased. It did not increase. So this is good news, right? Americans understand that this is wrong. Yet it doesn't take very many people to participate in political violence and foment that kind of spiral of violence. And is it the same case where people excuse violence committed by people, quote, on their side, that kind of asymmetry that you alluded to earlier? Is that true of violence as well?
It definitely is. Thankfully, the asymmetry, we're talking about low numbers here, so people are more likely to condone violence on their side, but it's still not high. Right? It's not like 60% of Americans are okay with violence as long as it's against their political opponents. In fact, Americans, there have been studies that Americans don't even like it when they see their side being really mean to someone from the other side. And that's obviously, it's a different kind of violence. But it's just to say that the good news here is that, most Americans they don't want this. They don't want a shrill political discourse where people resort to violence to resolve problems. But we have to separate that, and that's good, right? But we have to separate that away from the fact that you don't need 50% of people to support violence for violence to happen. And in a lot of ways, I think you have to think about, sometimes we can be a little bit too, we could think about public opinion a little bit too much on the individual level. It's weird, this coming from me, that as long as
this is your whole life doing
yeah,
this.
exactly. Well, as long as 3% don't like violence, then we're good. I mean, there's also the sort of the social context surrounding these things. That well, one of the things that we know from the ethnographic studies of sort of interethnic violence is that you can get these cascades of violence that happen at moments like this, where you have tensions between groups, you have rumors circulating about the other side wanting to transgress against your side, and that all you need is enough people to be convinced that the only way to solve that problem is by them to go over there and commit violence. Again, you don't need everybody to get up and cross the street and go create and commit violence. You just need a handful. And so, there have been interesting studies, actually horrible, listing off horrible things that have happened in, say, ethnic violence in India that have this characteristic where
including in boroughs of New York among ethnic, there's famous papers in political science that talk about small ethnic communities in New York and different groups, immigrants from Europe, kids getting beaten up on the way home from school, like that kind of intergroup tit for tat, where you come at me, then we come at you, and it goes back. It resembles gang violence, actually, in some way.
And the logic behind it doesn't require, I mean, this is what's important. The logic behind it doesn't require that everybody support that. So you could even have most people condemn it. But the people that are committing that violence think that they are acting in the best interest of their group. And in this case, when political violence happens, not just in the US, but in this particular moment, usually people doing it think that they are actually making the world a better place. And so the how do you deal with that is not about getting everybody to agree that that's a bad thing. Because even if 98% of people agree it's a bad thing, as long as you have people willing to do it, it's going to happen. And I should say here, because you did mention, I know a little bit about U.S. history. The U.S. has a very long and fraught history with political violence. So it's not like the U.S. is, I think the U.S. is in a very tender moment right now.
There's a feeling of like an ominous feeling here right now, that especially given what happened yesterday, what do the next 5 months look like, right? We could see a world where we see political violence going back and forth, where high-level politicians or activists, public intellectuals, whoever it is, are at a minimum subjected to violent threats, but potentially experience higher levels of violence. That's quite possible. Then there's also this looming resistance to Trump in the form of mass mobilization, right? This protest movement, pro-democracy movement is gathering steam at precisely the time when tensions are up and Trump is taking control of the National Guard. There are troops in DC that are now armed. And so I'm a worried guy. I skew worried, but I'm quite worried right now about what the next few months look like on the violence front. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about how do we avoid the worst? What are the best practices? I think we know that condemning violence, especially on one's own side, so to speak, is particularly important, and we need to take the temperature down. But at the same time, Trump gave us a case study about how not to act in this moment. His statement yesterday blamed the violence on the radical left and inflamed tensions, if we're just going to call it what it is. And so I just don't. You have a different perspective because you're abroad right now, and I'm curious what you're thinking about and what you see as a best practice for both elites, politicians, but also normal people in a time like this.
I mean, watching it from here is also very difficult too, because in a lot of ways I feel removed from it, but deeply affected by it since it is the country of my birth. What you just said at the beginning of your statement there is what worries me the most. So like I said, we've had political violence in the U.S. I mean, right, 5 presidents have been assassinated, and a few others there have been attempted assassinations. So the U.S. has a long history with this, but and a civil war, we might also note. But in this case, my concern is that at the same time that you have these kinds of actions, which are, this is a lone wolf type assassination.
We
don't know
don't,
who did
and
it
it's
yet.
also, we don't know who did
We
it.
don't know who did it, and we don't know
their political ideology or their
we don't know their
motivation.
reasons.
Yeah.
Right. But let's for a moment say it was for political reasons, right? That doesn't mean that I think tomorrow we're going to have copycat violence on either side. I don't think that necessarily has to be the next thing that happens. But the moment we're in right now is, to bring it back to the point of this, the reason why you invited me on here, right, is the Trump administration is right now doing some things that are, in the context of American politics, very provocative. Sending the National Guard to quell domestic tensions has happened in American history. It's happened even recently for instance, during the George Floyd protest. And usually when it happens because the governor of a state essentially asks the president for help. Here we have an instance where the president is sending a National Guard in over the objections of local and state leaders, which can create concerns that this is an attempt of a power grab. Now, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just this is all for show and to make it seem like, or maybe even to actually try to make crime go down and take the credit for it. That could be his motive. But right now, the situation we're in, given the level of polarization in the U.S., given the tensions that we have that can boil over into violence, my concern is that people are not willing to give the Trump administration, his opponents are not willing to give the Trump administration the benefit of the doubt on this, and to see this through the worst possible lens. What I said earlier is that all you need is some group of people to say, well, this is it. They're sending the people with arms to come after us. The only way to solve this is for us to fight back in kind. That's the kind of thing that can spill over into violence. And I'm very much worried that in the next 5 months, that I think one of the worst things that could happen would be for there to be violence that breaks out where National Guard members are targeted. I really hope that doesn't happen. But you asked me for kind of a worst case scenario. I think something like that could really devolve into sort of into chaos. Now, what do we do about that? That's the other question you asked me. I think that one of the things that we have to take sort of lessons from is the movements. Sort of, if you think that's what's going on, let's start from there. You think that this is a power grab from a would-be authoritarian. We have to take lessons from other places in history where this is the case, and that's, I think, the movement of nonviolent resistance, which is by not responding to provocations, even violent provocations, with violence. The second you do that, you legitimize the violence that happens. So I think that, what needs to happen in the US and in the world all over is for people who care about democracy, people who want to protect and strengthen democracy, have to be very clear that under no circumstances can violence be accepted, even when it seems justified to respond back in kind. That you have to say, we have to show people that we are nonviolent, even when people are being violent to us.
Well, and a big part of that, Erica Chenoweth came on a few weeks ago. Erica is a very prominent scholar of social movements and is firmly committed to nonviolence, not just morally, but empirically in terms of what works. And a big part of that is condemning violence, quote, on your own side, and distancing yourself from, if you're at a protest and someone throws a Molotov cocktail, that person needs to be out of the protest and shunned by the other protesters. Like that's what needs to happen in the moment of these types of events. And that's quite challenging, I think, given the disorder of of social movements. I wanted to we have a couple good audience questions. I did want to touch on another couple topics here with you. I feel like this is a country that needs healing, and it's a strange moment because at the same time there is a very important political battle going on. We're worried about political violence, but at the same time, protests are important, social movements are important. I do think the Trump administration is engaging in an authoritarian power grab, but we also need to heal. And polarization, we talked earlier in this sessions about effective polarization. This is something you've studied, this idea that we come to loathe the other side, and we cease to view them even as American. We see this happening in American homes, at the dinner table, around holidays, where the temperature is too high. People are fundamentally unable to talk to each other. And how do we heal? And maybe is the healing at an individual level something we all do in our own lives? I think one piece of work that I've been thinking about and reading is this idea that just displays of empathy with the other side really matter. And they can help humanize both sides. They can actually reaffirm a commitment to democracy among people. So how do we heal, Vin? Give us the 2-minute answer to that. But yeah, I think there's a feeling that I just feel like we're tearing at the seams, and maybe we don't heal quite yet. Maybe I don't quite know how to balance all the different things going on.
Well, there's two groups of people I think we talk about. There are those on the sidelines too. There's a group of people who feel apathetic, and they feel, they're not polarized per se, but they also feel that things are going crazy. So that's also part of the problem, right? How do we get people engaged in the political process without becoming polarized? Okay. The second thing is the folks that are really engaged in the political process do tend to be they care about these issues, and of course there's the old saying that we can disagree without being disagreeable, and I think that is possible. But the reason why I think that we see sort of what you call effective polarization, so it's disliking in the abstract people from the other side, is because there's this sense, or there's this perception that people on the other side who disagree with you, they don't just disagree with you, they look down on you, they think you're bad, and they think you're morally reprehensible for who you are. I think the first place to start, and I think you can sum that up by saying empathy, is to take the temperature down that way, to say, look, we can disagree about really fundamental things, but it doesn't mean that the other person has to be morally reprehensible. So that's number one. Number two, the research on this, the sort of optimistic research on this, is that Americans' attitudes or their feelings about members of the opposition political party, since there's only two in the U.S., that's pretty easy to think about. So Democrats versus Republicans, Republicans versus Democrats, are actually pretty malleable. So yeah, in the abstract, they say, yeah, I don't like those folks, but you can move them to feel more warmer for people from the other side when they see things like this, when they meet people from the other side and just see them as just regular people like themselves, and when they also see people with whom they disagree, listening to them. So those are easier said than done, right? Getting people to engage in those things, especially since we often are in sort of politically segregated places where we don't necessarily interact often with people with whom we disagree. And so in that case, it's really easy to invent a sort of boogeyman in your head. So, and then to finish the point with yesterday's events, then the people that stand in from the other side are exemplars that are, politicians or activists from the other side that say really incendiary things. And so one of the things I think that we need to do is just remind everybody that not everybody on the other side thinks that way, or, that they're normal, average folks just like you and me, who have families, who have jobs, who have, dreams and these sorts of things, and that politics isn't always front and center to their lives. So I think part of the process here is a social one, as a sociological one, getting people to interact with those who are different from them in ways that allow them to see each other's humanity.
It's funny you say that because so I studied China. I think a lot about US-China relations, and people of my school of thought, we tend to talk a lot about people-to-people exchange, like the importance of getting Americans and Chinese to interact, to get to know each other, to have dinner as a way of improving the relationship between the two countries, because right now it's not distinct, not too different from how Americans and Republicans and Democrats operate, where people are in these completely different information silos. They're not interacting, and that leads to a dehumanization that begets polarization, support for violence, and all these other things. So a lot of it is just about interacting. And I also wanted to highlight something you said just about treating people with respect, this feeling that not only does the other side disagree with you, they look down on you. That's why you rewind through the last 10 years of American political history. You think about that speech by Hillary Clinton where she called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. I mean, it's dehumanizing to talk to people that way, or to label people racists or Nazis when they aren't. And so I think that's an important lesson for all of us. There's a right way to talk about politics amongst ourselves, but also amongst people from different sides. And I think that one of the tricky issues here, the difficult issues, is, of course, our media environment doesn't reward that, right? Like, you go on any social media platform, and I say that as someone tried to build an audience for this, the crazier thing you say, the more incendiary thing you say, that's rewarded. You get more clicks, you get more engagement, you build your, like, so it rewards. Our whole media system, and arguably our political system, rewards this extremist rhetoric, dehumanizing rhetoric. And it's hard for nuance to break through. It's hard for respect to break through sometimes.
And not only there's that, and so that's bad enough for us, but also, guess who's stewing in that environment all day long? Our politicians. And I think that there's some work here in France, and I think probably the same in the US, that social media has not helped the discourse among politicians, that they come to approach each other with this kind of disrespect. And so, we also need our elected representatives to treat each other with enough respect to work with one another. And social media doesn't reward that at all.
No, and there's just a nastiness to political discourse, and you see it in comment sections. You see it's really disheartening. But I think it's something I think we need to remember. We can do this in our own lives, right? So we are interacting with people from the other side all the time, whether we realize it or not. And it's easy to build those relationships in person, and I do think all of that stuff matters. We're getting close to the end. You should probably get home for dinner at some point. But I had a couple of questions from the audience I wanted to raise to you, if you're okay with it.
Of course.
We have a question here. I'm just going to read it, not naming the person because I don't know if I have their consent. But when we look at the United States, we see a shift. Before, the majority were white Americans, but now it's different. Do you see that shift as something that wealthy white Americans are fearing, to be a minority, that they are trying to preserve their power? We see attacks on immigrants and different groups of minorities. So we haven't talked a whole lot about race. You've alluded to it, but what role does race and kind of racial replacement, if we want to call it that, like how is that affecting some of these dynamics you've outlined?
I mean, I think it's fundamental to understanding the feelings of status threat that some people have in the United States. And so I want to be careful here. This isn't, because it's very easy to sort of paint these kind of things with a broad brush. I'm not saying every white man or every white person feels this way, but among those who do feel this way, that this concern about a great replacement or something like this can motivate them to gravitate towards a strong leader who's gonna keep their group interest at heart. So, and this, by the way, is an old story. So we see this in other countries and other places, and it might not be about race, but it's about whatever sort of social hierarchy exists.
So we do this close. This has not been as depressing as some of the other sessions we've had. So you've managed to keep, well, it hasn't been too light. Let's be honest with ourselves. But I usually ask people to kind of give one piece of advice for people, like what do I do in a time like this?
I would encourage people to be brave. What am I doing right now? I'm trying to in politics. I'm trying to, affect change that I can at the margins. And from here, I can't go to protests and things like that, but I can participate on these kind of programs and this sort of stuff. But my advice, so this is like, do as I say, not necessarily as I do, is that if I could be philosophical for 2 seconds here, I think there's something really interesting about the U.S. National anthem, which is the first stanza that we all sing at ball games and things like this, actually ends with a question: do we still live in the home of the free and the brave? And I think that what I really like about that is it puts in relief that if you want to live in a free society, you always have to ask that question, because free societies are fragile for lots of reasons. And I think it's also interesting that the word brave is in there, because in order to stay living in a free society, you have to be brave and stand up for not just your freedom, but for other people's freedoms. And on top of that, you have to do it in ways that can be uncomfortable, that can be risky, while affirming, values to sort of a liberal democratic way of life. So I think it's actually very difficult to do. So my piece of advice is to be brave.
All right, Vin. Well, I don't want to keep talking because we should just cut, go to credits. But so thank you all on behalf of everybody here and everybody watching. Thank you to Kevin Arceneaux for sharing his insights and his work today and his wisdom. We can call it that. We have one more of these sessions scheduled. Next week is going to be with Adam Przeworski, Steve Levitsky, Dan Ziblatt, and Sue Stokes, all of whom are very, very important scholars in our field who study democratization, processes of democratic backsliding and erosion, and who have written quite a lot about this. We're going to go for 90 minutes, so it's going to be a longer session. And again, my job will be just to get out of the way and listen mostly. So that will be our next session. That's next Thursday. And I do plan on continuing this in some form. I think there's a lot to be talked about with respect to political violence, and there are some scholars of political violence and how we can tamp it down. I would like to reach out to folks like that and get them to do a session in the weeks to come. So please stay tuned for that. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you next week.
Thank you, everybody, as well. And thank you, Rory.